Come see us on tour. We're going to be in Baltimore, Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.
I'm Aaron Maté here with John Mearsheimer, and we're talking about the sea change in U.S. policy towards Ukraine and Trump walking away from the proxy war 3 years after Russia's invasion. And Professor Mearsheimer, this weekend, Steve Witkoff, who is a top Trump envoy, recently met with Vladimir Putin in Russia, said something that had previously been confined to a very small sliver of people in the U.S., including yourself, people willing to point out that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, whatever you think of it, was provoked. And this is Witkoff speaking to CNN.
War didn't need to happen. It was provoked. It doesn't necessarily mean it was provoked by the Russians. There were all kinds of conversations back then about Ukraine joining NATO. The president has spoken about this. That didn't need to happen. It basically became a threat to the Russians. And so we have to deal with that fact. And those are real facts on the ground here.
So that, again, is Steve Witkoff, a top envoy under Donald Trump, who's been given the responsibility of speaking to Russia. He was among the officials who spoke to Russian counterparts recently in Saudi Arabia. Professor Mearsheimer, your reaction to Witkoff saying that NATO expansion into Ukraine provoked Russia and was a security threat to Russia?
Well, as you know, Aaron, people like yourself and me and a number of other people have been making that argument for a long time. But it is a politically, or let me put it differently, it has been a politically incorrect view in the mainstream media in the United States. And therefore, people like us have no voice in the mainstream media because the mainstream of the foreign policy establishment was not interested in hearing what Witkoff just said. But the fact is that Witkoff is right, that it was the West's efforts, and here we're talking mainly about the United States. The United States bears the principal responsibility for causing this war, not the Europeans. It was the United States' efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders that really threatened Russia. I mean, they considered this to be an existential threat. And of course, the key ingredient in that policy was NATO expansion. But NATO expansion was not the only plank in that policy. It also included EU expansion and the color revolutions. Remember, we were interested in fostering a color revolution in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution. We were interested in bringing Ukraine into the European Union. And most importantly, we were interested in bringing Ukraine into NATO. The Russians made it unequivocally clear from the first time we announced this policy in April of 2008, that it was an existential threat, that they were not going to let it happen, and they would destroy Ukraine before they would let Ukraine join NATO and more generally become a threat on their border. And we refused to listen. We thought that we could shove NATO expansion down their throat. It's very important to understand that the first big tranche of NATO expansion took place in 1999. The Russians protested mightily, but they were too weak to do anything. So Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary came in. Then in 2004, we had the second big tranche, which included the Baltic states, Romania, Slovenia, Slovakia, and Bulgaria. And again, the Russians made it unequivocally clear that they viewed this as a serious threat, that they did not want this second tranche of NATO expansion. And what did we do? We shoved it down their throat because they were weak. When they protested after the 2008 announcement that Ukraine and Georgia would be brought into NATO, we did not listen to them. And the reason we did not listen to them is we thought they were weak and we could once again shove NATO expansion down their throat. And if you remember, Aaron, going back to the December 17th, 2021 letter and events not only in December 2021, but events in January and February of 2022, right before the war started, the Biden administration was telling everybody who would listen that the Russians were going to attack. Ukraine. Well, you would think in those circumstances, the United States would be going to great lengths to try to shut the war down. But we didn't try to shut the war down. Or let me put it differently. We didn't try to prevent the war from happening. And in fact, I think if anything, we seem to welcome the possibility of a war because we thought we would defeat the Russians. We thought our economic sanctions, coupled with Ukrainian successes on the battlefield, would bring the Russians to their knees. We had a really deep-seated contempt for the Russians, going back to the first two tranches of NATO expansion, and then the third tranche having to do with Ukraine. And the end result is we precipitated this war that broke out on February 24th, 2022. And at first we thought we were going to win it, which is why we didn't agree to continuing the negotiations in Istanbul right after the war started. We thought we had the Russians right where we wanted them. We're going to continue the war. We told Zelensky in March, April 2022 to walk away from the negotiations. We were going to defeat the Russians. Well, it didn't turn out that way. And now the Russians are on a roll. We have no leverage. Trump understands that, and he's going to cut a deal, and it's a deal on their terms, not our terms.
Just to show that Stephen Witkoff's comments were not a one-off, here's Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth appearing on his former home, Fox News, being asked, does he think, as the U.S. government has said constantly for 3 years, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked?
Russia attacked unprovoked into Ukraine 3 years ago tomorrow.
Fair to say it's a very complicated situation.
Okay, we'll leave it there.
So Pete Hegseth says it's complicated. He won't call it unprovoked, which again is just a dramatic reversal from the previous administration. And on the point about the Biden administration, let me ask you. So as you mentioned, the Biden administration refused to do anything concrete to avoid a Russian invasion. And in fact, Colin Kahl, a top Biden official, he later said that when Russia tried to discuss NATO, the future of NATO in Ukraine, he said the Biden administration wouldn't even discuss it, saying that we have this open door policy and that's firm, we won't even discuss it. But then throughout the course of the war, you have Biden repeatedly saying, yeah, I'm actually not going to invite Ukraine into NATO. They're not ready for it. And Biden maintained that line right up until the end of his administration, which was very frustrating for Zelensky, who had staked his country's survival on this promise from the U.S. that Ukraine would one day join NATO. So how is it the U.S. on the one hand basically risked a war over refusing to take NATO membership off the table, but then when push came to shove, Biden refused to offer Ukraine that NATO membership that itself caused the war?
I think it's a function of how the tide turned on the battlefield. I think before the war broke out, and certainly in the first year of the war, this would be 2022, from February 24th until the end of the year, it looked like we were in the driver's seat. And our commitment to Ukraine, and here we're talking about the Biden administration's commitment to Ukraine, was airtight, and we were convinced that we would eventually bring Ukraine into NATO. But then what happened is the tide began to turn. And as the tide began to turn in 2023, and then certainly in 2024, and it became clear that the Russians were likely to prevail in the war, we began to lose our enthusiasm for the idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO, because it would be hard to do if the Russians were prevailing on the battlefield. You can only think about bringing Ukraine into NATO if you defeat the Russians and you get some sort of ceasefire or meaningful peace agreement. Because if you give Ukraine an invitation to NATO and bring it into NATO when the fighting is going on, that would, I would think, mean an Article 5 kicks in and NATO has to come to the rescue of Ukraine. So Ukraine has to win the war before it's invited into the alliance. And again, you could think that was possible in 2022. You want to remember the Russians were in real trouble in 2022. They went into Ukraine with a very small force. and they were not highly trained, and they had lots of problems. And we were providing lots of support at that juncture to the Ukrainians, who were doing quite well on the battlefield. You want to remember, we had been training and arming the Ukrainians for a long period of time. So they were a reasonably formidable fighting force. So you could imagine in those circumstances that Ukraine would win the war and we could bring it into NATO. But again, the tide turned and that was no longer feasible. And now we're in a situation where Trump has completely given up on that idea. There's no chance Trump would ever show any interest in bringing Ukraine into NATO. And in fact, if anything, what's happening here is Trump is walking away from Ukraine.
Are you struggling with back taxes and unfiled returns? The IRS is escalating collections, adding 20,000 new agents, and sending millions of final demand letters. In these challenging times, your best defense is Tax Network USA. Don't let the IRS take advantage of you. With over 14 years of experience, Tax Network USA has saved their clients over $1 billion in back taxes, no matter your tax issue size. Their expertise is your advantage. They specialize in negotiating with the IRS, aiming to reduce your debt significantly. Tax Network USA doesn't just negotiate, they protect your assets from IRS seizures and manage your yearly returns for ongoing compliance. Importantly, they are licensed to help with all state tax issues, regardless of where you live in the United States. The clock is ticking. Don't wait as the IRS steps up its game. Seize control of your financial future now. Contact Tax Network USA for immediate relief and expert guidance. How do you do that? You call 1-800-958-1000 or visit tnusa.com/Jimmy. Don't let tax issues overpower you. Turn to Tax Network USA and find your path to financial peace of mind. Come see us on tour. We're going to be in Baltimore, Hartford, Connecticut, Syracuse, Atlantic City, Levittown, New York, Cohoes, New York, and Providence, Rhode Island. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.